The theory infuses itself into the utopian arena of the communist ideals, which generates the socialist implementations, such as the common extortation of the public resources, dividing all resources away from the individual into the collective distributed evenly amongst all. And some, they say, are more equal than others. And while there are separations, the separations are to be equal. And thus, the separate but equal arrangement of the socialist arrangement is the dystopian nightmare of the Confederacy and their plantations, actively implemented on maturity, of actively getting parties to accept the propagandist dystopia of anti-reality, or the combination of nature and nature's law, as nature's law is subject to nature's God, which wrote it, and thus the collective inside of the community, as is separate to the other species, would have to sustain itself under its own hierarchy, as opposed to the predatory natures of the exploitations of competing species. Generating this function understands the position that the communist separates into the various parties and interests, such as those who wish to use political means, nonviolent means, in order to establish themselves, only revealing themselves as dystopian upon maturity, at which point the socialists would have actively infused themselves into the Nazis' party, as they would have actively partnered with it, and with that have had the shepherd's idealism actively infused by the Jewish Bible's position on shepherding as a pastoral people is the primary function. Thus, the shepherd able to sacrifice or to kill its sheep in order to eat it beyond the resources of its ability to produce wool generates the mentality. So, to this extent, they actively have the Hegelian dialectic position of large sacrifices inside the units amongst their sheep, and thus those who are designed to be killed for the greater good would then sacrifice themselves willingly, subordinating themselves to the anti reality, which allows for them to be destroyed under their accepted position, allowing the advancements of the shepherds to peruse deeper into the greater constructs and structures of the adversary system which they are infecting as a malicious virus, which is the functional theory amongst the history studied from certain points of view, which generated the position of the communism and the wizard communism, which generated the Nazism, which is founded on the wizard communism, which conducts the function of communism with a false pretense of capitalism, as the centrally planned economy has determined who gets to win and who gets to lose. And while they have a light structure concerning the pressures against those corporations, those would be wartime conditions which had not allowed themselves to expire in favor of a more settled down, controlled system. And thus, the mechanism of the state of emergency requires the capitalism in order to fund the function of the war, at which points the active funding by the FBI inside the United States, amongst the other Confederate structures, which has actively depleted American resources in order to establish the Nazi Party, released Hitler from prison in order to get elected, and thus creates his domination of Germany to Nazism, propagating the Second World War as payment, as well as the mass sacrifice of the Jews and other undesirables by the white supremacists inside the United States. at which point these positions actively compete against each other, and thus the stresses of war compels the active collection of resources, and thus the state being preoccupied with the war cannot actively interfere with the companies which actively have to sustain it in the resource management structures, as they have to take on faith that their overstretched mental structures can sustain themselves, and thus they have to, by virtue of not having alternative uh, reliable methods, concede to capitalism, at least temporarily, to fund the war against the greater structure. Now, the function of the Germans had actively um, escaped the function of the collective nonviolent socialists inside the West, which were creating centralized banks. And thus, the position of the worldwide banking structure, which was actively conducting itself under the mechanism of compulsory debts as a form of currency, was uh, a methodology to justify the eradication of the Germans' potential as the Germans were escaping it. And thus, this position of the opposition required the false narratives to be generated, including the position that the Germans were to accept the entire liability in their deal with the devil, to accept the resources, and thus the American dollars being paid to them was paid for an act of treason against their country, and as well as the structure of accepting the fraudulent positions of the massed Holocaust structures, which many of the Germans did not want to cooperate with, and the United States compelled them to, as none of them would accept the transfer of Jews willingly by the Germans on purpose, as they were constructed by the West collectively um, to be killed as the false narrative structure in the illusions, and thus the mechanism of many of the Western banks being controlled primarily in concept by the Jews had this concept from the communists, which have generated the position of those shepherds who were willing to sacrifice their flocks, and thus the mechanism of the Jewish banker um, was actively responsible for propagating the threats amongst those who were following them and those who were under their control or able to be captured and manipulated, generating the pretense for the threats perceived by the Nazis legitimately or illegitimately, which they have taken the payout in order to conduct retaliations against, in both cases, forming the strawman structure constructed by um, the American FBI structure, which has actively been an illegal mechanism constructed by the Confederacy, which was generating the protections of the white supremacist structure, including the function of blackmail and intimidation rackets in order to control the American political structure, seeking Nazi overthrow of the American government to ignore the civilians from being able to form a government, generating the permanent separation of the civilians from authority, and thus the destruction of the Nazis inside the Second World War generated the mass ingestion through Project Overcast and Project Paperclip in order to establish Nazis inside of the United States, which includes many of the communists who have infiltrated the Nazi structure, including some of the Jews who had made it into higher ranking members of the Nazi structure, which some may have been killed and others may not have been, such as the Nuremberg trials, which generates the pretense concerning all of the arrangements of having actively conducted itself. If the Nazis were purely against homosexuals, then how did Hitler actively have positive relationships with homosexuals? If the Nazis were so aggressively anti Jewish, then why was the angel of death allowed to exist? The function generates its self-explanation once you have an impartial observation of history, and these explanations are less theory and more than accepted behind closed doors dealings with other parties, which, having been legitimately conducted, would, by virtue of having been done, been a confession to their government of its viability, and thus whether or not it would be officially accurate. The behind the closed doors is unofficial actions, and thus the function of the groups having conducted those particular arrangements could then specifically state the superiority and confidence of those things to be true, whether or not they were psyops in order to create false narratives, compounding the reinforced objective designed by the opposition party. In these various deals with the devil, which, having conducted by a proxy, would actively be conducted through the opposition side, and thus the mechanism of the assumption of the occult worship, which they would have actively infused themselves to, as the Nazis were religious radicals for historic occultism, would have generated its pretense under the assumption that the devils do exist as real life existing creatures, and thus the mechanism of those creatures having control or an influence as principalities and powers, as is discovered in the Bible, would actively be generating the pretense of the conflicts, and thus their acceptance of this position generates the larger cosmic objectives, such as the forming of legacy legends, which generates their active acceptance of each of the roles, willingly rejecting reality where necessary, as Nazis were not inherently known for smelling their own farts. So, to examine the question concerning the Nazis' objective theory, you must continue to the pretense of the historic Confederacy and its KKK militia, as its espionage militia actively conducted its fraudulent disguised missions in order to conduct social engineering by terrorist campaigns, at which point their ability to infiltrate the United States government would allow them to edit codes in their favor, such as protecting the pretense of color of law from being considered a hate crime, whereas the same act conducted by individuals for the same reason would be considered a hate crime, and thus the ability to conduct that manipulation would, by definition, be a custom without reason, which is a separation from American law. And thus, the pretense concerning the Jews being a threat would have been specifically tied to their ability to have aligned themselves with the KKK in its operations against the other members of society, and if then, then so. At which points the function of being able to acquire such a group in order to form a mafia, in order to engage in the function of a criminal organization, which then would not be prosecuted and thus would not have a court record concerning their identity, would form the pretense proof to the Nazis' claim that uh, the quote unquote Jewish bankers would be an exponential threat, which could only actually be competently considered inherently from the perspective that if they were able to conduct their ascension to power without the ability, without the restriction of the Constitution, and thus acting outside of the rule of law in its entirety, and thus existing outside of law, would then be the foundational pretext concerning the legitimacy of their claims in any of these particular arguments, which would have reinforced their objective, which could, by definition, actively being conducted as its own PSYOP mission, generating the necessary parts, which could be um, conveniently found by investigators in order to legitimize particular narratives essential to reinforce predetermined outcomes in a Hegelian dialectic arrangement, such as the arrangements of the normal conducting of satanic rituals, such as the ones actively promoted by Marx and Hegel in the Hegelian dialectic, which is satanic ritual. But if that is all true, then the ingestion of the Nazis for all of the experiments would be the ingestion of the products purchased by the major influx of money into the Nazis in the first place, and thus they were paid for the product which they executed viably, which cleans their records as they were conducting operations under unitary executive theory, and thus the creation and existence and subsistence of the Nazi threat is a creation of the unitary executive theory, and thus legalized under these Confederate operations for the wizard communism to actively reinforce collective socialism of compelled acceptance of the rejection of reality in favor of a self-injury, subordinating themselves to a hierarchy which pretends to serve them while exploiting them maliciously. Now, with these powers in place, the functional proof concerning the Gulag Archipelago would have actively been downsized, as the mechanism of anti-communist rhetoric would have actively been promoting itself until the mechanism of the book Gulag Archipelago would have been released by its inmates, at which point it would have been actively suppressed, which would generate, ironically, a pro-communist position as a the Book of Reality serves as oppositional force, triggering those who are automating their support of the communists, which have actively been infiltrating their societies as the soft power influence structure, which generating its position primarily by the illusion and its ability to control others by historic occultist functions of wizards. So the function of social manipulation in prehistory wizard functions, such as before the Romans, when fighting the Druids, would actively be maintaining these contests, at which point the manipulation of the Druids, or the manipulation by the Druids against the general public, would actively be exploited in favor of the promotion of them as the priesthood, at which point these pretenses would have actively been researched and maximized by the communists, especially by the exponential promotion of the Nazis, who, being freaks for the occult and history, generate their exponential investigation on how to discover and reproduce it in a scientific method, generating the normalization of it as a superior effective power against the social weaknesses which could be exploited. And these types of techniques, having been studied and exponentially expanded, being infused inside the CIA and FBI and others, would have actively had its own research mechanism in order to reinforce itself against the American population and others, at which point the mechanism of their inherent strategies concerning the overthrow of democracies, such as the FBI's Nazi coup attempt, which never stopped but merely had scheduled restarting functions as the soft pressure in order to move the function being abrased, generates the position of them having not been destroyed as an infection, allowing them to subtly increase their position exponentially until the left looks like the right functionally. At this junction, you have these mechanisms of the wizard spells infused by the Nazis' research, which is fundamental to the opposition of the United States by the insurgent terrorists loyal to the white supremacists who actively scoff at the pretense of law and hate its government, which by definition would generate a nation of laws government would be a law enforcement mechanism, which would then arrest them as they, being fundamentally adversarial towards each other, would have a permanent contemptuous position, generating the pretense of their contest against it in the systematic power dynamics, removing law from the structure of all negotiations into the function of those power dynamics, generating the pretense concerning the acceleration of compromised fellows, such as those who can easily be developed for the larger objective of their historic goals, such as the creation of someone like John Brennan, who, having been discovered as a communist by his own confession, under his the investigation for him under the lie detector tests, and James Comey and many of the others who have been discoverable as loyal to Soviet communism, generate the pretense of the proof that the United States, despite its formal position of being anti communist, having actively accelerated them in those positions, generating the proof that its law enforcement structure is inadequate on purpose by a refusal by dereliction of duty for the insurrection against these United States, creating a state of impotence and effeminacy, which is generated by the Nazis, which generates the pretense of their opposition and aggression and malice, as toxic femininity is their primary strategy, as order is their enemy. Toxic femininity is their chief ally and mechanism for war. Generating these positions, they actively promote the groups to be compromised, such as the women promoted by the female narcissist for the Feminist Incorporated structures, which generates the fascist position of having accelerated into those positions as a false advantage, which exploits their political identity into corruption, collapsing them exponentially as a collective political identity until they are systemically dissolved into the rapist culture, having removed all of their positions. The ladder is kicked out from under them and they are pushed off of their platform to suffer and wallow, having sold themselves and their children into the rapist culture, and thus they, aiding and abetting as accessories before, during, and after the fact, are entirely responsible for all damages of the domestic abusers and their structures, which actively reinforces itself, such as with the police's thin blue line, which generates a position of mutual defense culture, at which point, if the general public has a claim legitimately against an officer, it is normalized that the other officers will lie for that officer in order to protect it from recourse, making the civilians an enemy population and themselves their own population, and thus the defense of themselves against the civilian population generates an insurgency atmosphere created by actual insurrectionists, which have been manipulating them by the social engineering to accept their position as militant adversaries, generating these pretenses of defenses of the criminal black market, which actively compounds on itself into the historic position of miscalculations and intentional rewrites of history in order to defend them by falsified data. These systems actively being promoted through wizard schools or colleges generates the pretense of the active ability to indoctrinate the targeted system to be actively converted into its oppositional force, and thus those who are the highest mechanisms, who would be considered the most competent, are actually the most foolish, generating a series of generations of highly educated morons, which is on purpose, as their base education is the rejection of reality, and thus, claiming to be wise, they have become fools. Their fairy tale stories of utopia and superiority generates their higher grade wizard structure, to the capacity of the rejection of capitalism's trade of money in favor of communist trade of people. And thus, if you can trade people, you can extort them and spend all of the money, and thus you can functionally have all of the advantages of capitalism and its wealth in favor of the communist arrangements, and thus they can just skip the steps where they have to be competent, which they would not be able to from their base rejection of reality, generating a system of higher aristocracies which are entirely inadequate and infertile concerning their capacity of sustaining themselves, as they are a permanent state of third generational wealth, and in these pretenses generates a system of formal collapses, which is exponentially conducted and redirected against the majority population, which is being captured by their communist arrangements, creating generic collapses of the collective wealth of the civilian population, which is being injured by the act of war from these operations, and the functional advantage to them is seen on maturity but not until then, at which point the function of their extortions produces their blindness to their own destruction, while at the same time the observation of its reality. Thus, the standard practice of how they conduct themselves is observably destroying the general public as a military weapon against the civilian populations in their economic warfares and their lawfares and extortion racket mechanism. At which point the end extortion, which is actively demonstrated by the civilians who conduct similar rackets for their profiteering, are then extorted into their collapse, which is the same structure that the communists are using in the extortion of the civilians. So they copied and pasted the same structure of failure onto them. They've just deferred it as a weapon. And that mechanism generates the inevitability that at some point there is no more road to kick the can down, forcing them to ingest the entirety of its collapse from their insufferable incompetence. And this monopoly over the education would actively conduct military operations against competition, which would have been promoted by the Jewish mafia and banker structures under the Nazis' theory, which generates their opposition to the school of hard knocks, which they would have known about and actively sought to undermine as a viable educational structure, uh, would not be subordinated to the insurrection, and thus would not be in compliance with anti-reality, and thus would not be educated fools, and thus would actively serve as competition, and thus would defeat their monopoly of insufferable inferiors with a superiority complex, requiring in the record Lindsey Graham's white supremacist communism to have targeted David and specifically the School of Hard Knocks connected to David in order to, even in the case that the Americans restore David's title, their Confederate policies from ex post facto, criminalizing the existence of the school itself, would seek to subordinate it under the fraud to the alternative mechanisms, generating an inferior education, stealing the education under a fighting retreat mechanism, under permanent opposition and contempt for reality. And that reality's capitalism as is generated by the God who creates capitalism under the Nazi theory that the Jews believe in capitalism, which is their God, and thus the mechanism of the Jewish God is the endorsement of capitalism, which is the function of the total diversifying mechanism of each person having been created as an individual, maximizing their own particular skills for the largest potential productive ability. Theoretically, a certifiable proof of the continuation of white supremacist communism would have been their payment structures and their extortions of the Indian communities, which are owed debts under sales and treaties with the United States, which, having been compromised by the communists, would have actively been putting them in mismanaged positions, generating their artificial poverty by the communist structure. Despite the high grade value owed to them, they are put into insufferable poverty and not allowed to escape, as the structure of the terrorism against them is to the social engineered position or extent of not requiring direct violence while actively leaving it available for the violence, such as the mass uh, killings and the non mass killings of the Indians throughout the ages, such as, but it's not limited to, the continuation of the raping of Indian women under those pretenses so that the investigations conducted um, in their defenses would systemically be put outside of context so that if the white supremacists are caught actually, despite all of the advantages put on by disadvantaging the Indians, they would still mostly get away with it, as the Indian reservations would not have authority to punish the white supremacists outside of the jurisdiction of the white supremacists inside the United States, as they are a foreign nation. These developments of long-term invested cons includes the function of the white supremacist communist infiltration, which generates the separation of the United States rule of law from the Confederacy and its systemic racism, at which point those who claim historic norms in opposition to constitutional authority, reinforcing the systemic racism against the advances of the Americans who, having gained powers against them, generate the ability to sustain the creation of order, and that order, removing the arbitrary chaos and the arbitrary abuses from that chaos, generates the systemic order which exponentially improves the resources collected by the benefits and blessings of order, at which point those who are claiming these historic positions are subverting the function of all of the progress generated by that order and law in clear systemic opposition to the prophets of order, seek the abuses historically without verification by the obstruction and manipulation and contempt for courts, generating the false records with the pretense to manifestation of the predetermined outcome by the white supremacist communism and their centralized economy in the various aspects and stratas of society, actively being manipulated as the change of status without uh, due process is fraud, and with contempt for courts and defrauding of the courts, you have a nullification of a due process in favor of the finality of the KKK kangaroo courts, which generates false outcomes, specifically conducting lawfare as a criminal insurrectionist operation for the usurpation of office and contempt for the authority which bestows power to the office, at which point this continued opposition to the civilian government is the maintained position of those claiming historic precedents against normalized advances into order into a structured society, destroying it in favor of historic chaos and its criminal markets. The old boys clubs and secret societies actively reinforcing their bigot taxes, compulsorily manufacturing the alterations, and thus the United States would, in those arrangements under those jurisdictions, be controlled by cultish societies loyal to devils or to Satan proper, which generates the pretense of their extortion for the purpose of human suffering. The strategies of these secret societies have actively infused separate denominations of the KKK, such as the military industrial educational complex, which, having infected the educational structure, is actively conducting James Lindsay strategy type religious radical functions, which generates false papers in order to legitimize their criminal abuses, which they seek to exercise against the general community, as an exploitation in favor of arbitrary abuses as the cultural standard norm in a neo-feudalist structure, as they collapse the United States capitalism into the neo-feudalism under the white supremacist communisms, facilitating a new road to serfdom. And this functionary position requires their highly educated mechanism who've exclusively studied the systems of conducting fraud and scams generate redactions concerning the necessary arguments concerning the subjects, which then create uneven mechanisms concerning the arguments, as if the party arguing with them would have had the active information essential for the argument, they would remove or redact it, and thus there would not be an educated, sober response to theirs, making theirs the only sober, educated response, providing false legitimacy to their scam, at which point those who are most often right are most often not prepared, and the mechanism by their dirty tricks conduct those redactions and the false classification of the information for their extortionary racket and false legitimacy, promoting those least capable and competent to support the public interest, such as the historic fraudulent arguments concerning racism, such as genetic guilt, such as the example of Sam Harris, which has actively promoted genetic guilt as a foundational quality, including the mechanism of his willingness to conduct dirty tricks against political adversaries who he views as undesirable or a baseline threat to his agenda, which could be something as simple as someone who isn't insufferably stupid. At which point, having the minimum amount of competence and common sense would generate a pretense of those who have an actual morality basis, such as the Christians, who, having actually studied the Bible, would generate a competent argument towards their position, creating a position of religious opposition to those parties until they become useful, and similar to the KKK in its incorporation of the Irish and the Jews, would then turn on them upon maturity, at which point they would be an extortable resource which would then be deposited and opposed on maturity once they are appropriately vulnerable to that. At which point you have the systemic normalization of the core genetic whiteness as the pretense of superiority, and thus the pretense of fraud in favor of their arbitrary political interests create political victims which have been targeted for these wars by lawfare, generating the pretense of the false experts, such as the ones expressed for the white supremacy in its various fraudulent arguments under the classifications and extortions, generating the inability of the commoner who would actively be necessarily relied on in order to defend against the extortion to not understand the scam and thus fall prey to the extortion inherently, such as the Fres Ubulu mechanism of actively finding those who are a good, noble heart, who are capable of being defrauded by the appropriate classification of the essential information, as well as the necessary complexity of the scams being promoted to be conducted against them, as they are systemically designed to, in good faith, conduct criminal subversions in favor of chaos as chaotic good, under that mechanism alignment, generating the pretense of actually undermining the overall structure, generating a catastrophic evil, generating the pretense of them then being subordinated to the function of having to, in their superiority and nobility, save a person who is made vulnerable, who is an active aspect of the cult, would then replace themselves with the target who was a part of the cult to be sacrificed instead, as they are systemically pressured into the structure as the society is continued into their perpetuated function of hell, at which point the collective society being turned into hell itself is generating off of those social engineered structures for chaotic evil under the position as the person being promoted for the good would have been actively thinking that their good and noble superiorities under that delusion generates the pretense of the superiority of the structure of society, as it is slowly revealed to them that they are inherently digestible by the demon lord, who has tricked them under their acceptance and corruption towards absolute degeneracy under false pretenses. Thus, you have fraudulent positions, such as the videos that have actively been promoted several years back, where there's a person who says that we're talking to someone, and they told them to go to hell, and they said, I won't go there, I simply just won't go. The function position is that they are the favorite mark of Rezubulu, who by definition is deceiving them into not going to a location called hell, but the creation of hell in their own society, and thus the territory by which they reside becomes infernalized, and in the infection of the hellish become rebuked upon maturity, and according to these addiction functions, are systemically understood as something that they're getting away with until the addiction holds them, at which point they are no longer the exception and subordinated to the arbitrary hell, which only will seem more difficult to leave once they seek to acquire sobriety. Once they have found that they are trapped, they trying to struggle their way out of it, similar to the function of those who are addicted to drugs and alcohol or cigarettes or heroin. They'll actively go through extreme times of withdrawals and sweats and misery, and it's going to be absolute hell for them, even if they're going through the correct steps, and there are diminishing returns for their subordination and the continuation of the addiction, which is the same functional thing, except for the function that it is not their body, but the collective structure of society, which is suffering the withdrawal symptoms and the um, diminishing returns of the active ingestion of the infectious materials. Fundamentally, in a culture that promotes plausible deniability, the expectation or the common assumption is guilt.